Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to finish the lecture that I wasn't able to finish on in the last class. But I do want to go over again this Bandura and Cooper study with the bowling game and the M&Ms just because I was running out of time. I rushed it and I misspoke a couple of times, and I just want to clarify everything a bit more. In the study, children were playing a bowling game and they were able to reward themselves for their performance with candy, specifically M&Ms. And it was up to them when and how much candy that they would receive. However, before their turn at the game, some of the children would watch another person, either an adult or another 9-year-old, bowl and reward themselves with candy for their performance. Now, the models differed in the standard that they used to determine if they should reward themselves. So for the low criterion, these were the low performers. These models would take candies for scores as low as 10 points. However, the high performing or high criterion model would only reward themselves for scoring 20 to 30 points. And 30 points was the max, so this was like top third performance. Now, a third condition was that there was no model. So children in the control condition didn't watch anybody, they just bowled and rewarded themselves as they saw fit. Now, after watching the model, or not if it's a control group, the children would bowl themselves, but the scores that were achieved by the children were set in a fixed pattern by the researchers. So all the children pretty much scored the same across all their different attempts. So the results in the study found that when children had a model, they tended to use that model as a guide to when engage in self-reinforcement. So for example, if they watched the high criterion model, those that scored 20 to 30 and then would reward themselves, the children participants would do something similar. They were much more likely to reward themselves if they scored in that upper third rather than the mid or lower thirds. Those in the low criterion model tended to reinforce themselves more, starting at that 10 to 15 point level, so kind of that mid level. And then what we see with the children in the control or no model condition is that they tended to reinforce themselves independent of their performance. So one of the takeaways from the study is that people, and including children, won't always give themselves what they want, such as candy. Sometimes there's going to be some sort of expectation or criteria that has to be met before they reward themselves, such as those that watch the high-performing model. From a social cognitive perspective, this is pretty important because it shows this role of human agency, that we're able to make decisions, set goals, and if we meet those goals, we can give ourselves a reward. If we don't meet those goals, we can punish. But the basic idea is that we still have human agency, and we can make these determinations and goals ourselves. Now, another factor that's going to influence whether or not we engage in a behavior is the idea of self-efficacy. And this is basically the confidence that you're able to perform a behavior necessary to produce some sort of outcome. You can think of this as basically just a sense of confidence in your ability to perform. And what studies have found is that higher levels of self-efficacy will predict goal achievement. If you think you're going to be able to do well on an exam, you're going to be more likely to do well on that exam rather than if you think you're just going to fail automatically. Importantly, research in self-efficacy has found that there's ways that we can actually set up our goals that's A, more realistic, and B, more probable that we're going to achieve those goals if we set them and following these different guidelines. Now first you want to set specific, behavioral, and measurable goals. Now what this is going to do is this is going to help make your goals from the abstract, these general ideas of wanting to perform better perhaps, to something much more concrete, something that you can actually judge your performance to see if you're meeting those expectations or those goals that you have. So for example, if you want to learn the guitar, instead of just saying, I want to learn the guitar, you might want to just focus on, okay, I first want to learn the tune, then I want to learn different chords, then different scales, and then perhaps a song or two. And what that's doing is it's taking this large abstract idea of learning to play the guitar and breaks it down into much more smaller, manageable pieces. And this leads to the second guideline of setting performance-based goals, or what one has to do, rather than outcome goals. So for playing the guitar or learning how to play the guitar, a performance goal would be for every night, practice your scales for an hour. You also want to set some difficult but realistic goals. And this is important because if you set goals that are way too difficult and not realistic, you're going to get frustrated and end up quitting. But if you set goals that are too easy, well, then you're just going to get bored and you'll ultimately give up. By kind of finding that sweet spot between too easy and too hard, you're going to keep yourself engaged in the activity and making sure that you're increasing your performance as well as getting closer to reach your goal. You also want to set positive and not negative goals. So for the guitar, you might want to say, you know, I want to get through this song once without stopping, rather than I don't want to make any mistakes. You'll also want to have some short range goals and breaking your larger goal into different sub goals or short range goals. And this is going to help you develop the mastery in order to get to that ultimate goal. You'll also want to set some definite time spans for achievement. So give yourself some deadlines that are manageable, not too tough, but not too easy for you. And this will help you keep motivated to complete your goal. Now, what are some determinants of self-efficacy? Well, first is performance experience. Have you engaged in this behavior before? And were you successful or failure? So if you succeeded on a task that's either similar or the same task, you're going to have higher levels of self-efficacy, but if you failed, you're more likely to have lower levels of self-efficacy. Observational learning can also help us increase our self-efficacy, and this is just by watching someone else complete those same types of behaviors. So for example, what you can do is if you're trying to learn how to, for example, cook a nice dinner, you can go to YouTube, look up a whole bunch of cooking tutorials, and just by watching them do it, you can start to feel more confident that you're able to carry out and make that same meal. Verbal persuasion can also increase our self-efficacy if people give us encouraging messages. You can do it, you got this, go for it. However, if people give us discouraging messages such as, you suck, you can't do it, this is too hard for you, well, that's going to lower our levels of self-efficacy. Also, emotional arousal can influence our self-efficacy by how we interpret our physiological state. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in social psychology, but when we kind of have this increase of physiological arousal, we may interpret it in one way or another. We can view it as enthusiasm and euphoria, so we're really excited, but we can also interpret that as being anxious or scared. So if we interpret it more as enthusiasm, we're going to increase our levels of self-efficacy, but if we view it as anxiety, it might actually make us feel like we're going to be less able to achieve our goal. Now, Walter Mischel was another notable social cognitive theorist, and he essentially argued the idea that we need to consider the social environment and situational factors, but we also have to put a bit more focus on the cognitive aspects of how personality develops, and basically in how people characteristically deal mentally and emotionally with their experiences. One of the notable observations that Mischel had was this idea of the consistency paradox, and that's that we perceive or expect someone's behavior to be pretty consistent, but we actually see that it's not as consistent as we would expect. And this occurs across different situations. You may be very responsible and making sure you get your work done on time for school, but if you work at a job that you don't like, you might not necessarily be as responsible in completing your different responsibilities. For some, this even called into the question of whether or not personality exists, or if we're more influenced by a situation than any kind of dispositional characteristics. However, Mischel argued that both personality and situation are important when we're trying to understand why people behave the way they do. And it was these observations that led Mischel to formulate this cognitive affective personality system, or CAPS, which is the dynamic interplay between the characteristics a person brings to the situation and the characteristics of the situation itself. Now, some of the characteristics an individual might bring to the situation is their expectations about the situation, such as the outcome or its difficulty, their beliefs, their goals, what emotions that they have, and whether or not they're able to engage in different types of self-regulatory processes, such as self-control. And some of the characteristics of the situation itself might be, is it a social situation versus not? Is it an important situation? All these types of things kind of interact with each other to determine an individual's behavior, according to Mischel. Through CAPS, Mischel argued this idea of the if-then behavior consistencies. And this suggests that there is some sort of consistency in behavior, but it is found within similar situations. And basically, we can think of it as this if-then statement is, and if certain conditions are met, then certain types of behaviors will be met. So for example, if Mark gets angry at his partner, then he will shout and become aggressive. But if we change the if to if Mark becomes angry with his boss, then we're going to see a different behavior, such as then he will withdraw and sulk. So what changes with the if part of the statement, who Mark is angry at, is not just a different person, but the nature of the relationship entirely, where the nature of his relationship with his partner might be much more intimate, relatable, and a bit more informal, whereas the nature of his relationship with his boss is going to be a bit more professional. And then there's also the idea of the power differential between Mark and his boss. So all these different things must be considered when we're trying to predict behavior from the situation and the person. Thank you.